Chapter 1. The Man Who Wouldn't Bend. Scott Williams had long ago stopped counting days. First, he tried. Everyone did. You scratched marks into the wall, or mentally flipped calendar pages, or told yourself you'd remember anniversaries of things that no longer mattered. Day 1. Day 30. 6 months. 1 year. By year 3, he forgot what day it was. By year 5, he forgot to care. Now, somewhere beyond year 7, he knew that much only because another inmate had mentioned it in passing. Scott measured time differently. Not in days or months. In routines. In repetitions. In how long it took for the same guard to start telling the same story again as if it were new. His world was 8 feet by 6 feet. You ever think about just saying yes? The voice came from the bars. Randall. Not his real name, no one used those here, but close enough to answer to. Scott didn't look up from where he sat on the narrow bunk, hands clasped loosely together. No. Randall snorted. That's not even believable. It is for me. There was a pause, the kind where someone decides whether or not a conversation is worth continuing. Randall leaned against the bars. 7 years, man. Scott finally lifted his head, his expression neutral, not defensive, not angry, just settled. 7 years doesn't make something right. No, but it makes it easier to pretend it is. Has that worked out for you? Randall opened his mouth, then stopped, exhaled instead. Fair point. Silence settled back in. Not uncomfortable, just present. Scott had gotten good at silence. He'd also gotten good at conversations that ended nowhere. From the outside, his life would look like stubbornness calcified into something immovable. A man refusing a simple compromise to regain his freedom. Say yes. Agree to the payments. Walk out the door. Simple. Except it wasn't. Scott leaned his head back against the wall, eyes drifting toward the ceiling. There were cracks up there. He'd cataloged them once. There had been 17. One that looked like a crooked river, another like a jagged smile. He didn't count them anymore. Still think you're right? Randall asked, quieter now. Scott took a moment before answering, not because he didn't know, but because he always chose his words carefully. I know I am. That's different. It shouldn't be. Randall shook his head. World doesn't work like that. Scott allowed the faintest hint of a smile, the kind that barely lifted one corner of his mouth. Yeah, I noticed. The irony wasn't lost on him. It never had been. He hadn't shouted in court. He hadn't insulted the judge. He hadn't made a scene. He had simply refused. That had been enough. At the time, it had felt almost surreal, like he was watching someone else's life unfold in real time. His wife's voice echoing in memory, the quiet confirmation of the DNA test, the sterile language of legal documents. Not your child. Not your responsibility. Except, according to the court, it was best interest of the child. Scott exhaled slowly, the memory passing through him like a fading echo rather than something sharp. Anger had burned out years ago. All that remained was certainty. You ever think, Randall said after a while, maybe this ain't about the kid anymore? Scott didn't respond immediately, because that question, unlike most, had weight. Eventually, he said, it never was. Randall frowned. Then what is it about? Scott tilted his head slightly, considering whether there was any value in answering that honestly. Finally, he said, freedom. Randall let out a low whistle. That's a big word for a guy in a cell. Scott's faint smile returned. That's why it matters. The guard's footsteps echoed down the hall before either of them spoke again. Routine. Footsteps. Keys. Doors. Voices. Predictable. Controllable in its own limited way. Scott shifted forward slightly as the guard stopped outside his cell. Williams. Scott stood without being told to. Another routine. You've got a visitor. That wasn't routine. Scott paused. It was subtle, so subtle most wouldn't notice, but it was there. A hesitation. A flicker of something unfamiliar. Visitors had stopped. Years ago. At first, there had been regular attempts. Lawyers. Family. People trying to convince him to reconsider. To compromise. To be reasonable. When those failed, the visits became less frequent. Then stopped entirely. Scott had adjusted. People left. Systems didn't change. Principles didn't bend. That had been his world. Until now. I think you've got the wrong person, Scott said calmly. The guard shook his head. No mistake. Some DA. Scott blinked once. That was new. Randall muttered under his breath. Well, that can't be good. Scott ignored him, stepping toward the bars as the guard unlocked them. Didn't say what it's about, the guard added almost casually. But she looked determined. Scott stepped out into the hallway, the movement feeling both familiar and strangely distant. Lead the way. As he followed the guard down the corridor, Scott found himself noticing things he hadn't paid attention to in years. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the faint echo of voices from distant cells, the rhythm of footsteps that weren't his own. Change. It was a small thing. A visit. Conversation. But in a life built entirely on repetition, even small things carried weight. Scott kept his expression neutral as they approached the visitor room. He wasn't expecting anything. He didn't allow himself to, because expectations led to disappointment, and disappointment required energy he no longer wasted. Still, as the door opened and he stepped inside, he couldn't quite ignore the quiet, unfamiliar thought that slipped into his mind. Why now? Chapter 2: The Audit. Evelyn Carter did not believe in loose ends. They irritated her. Not in the loud, dramatic way that made for courtroom speeches, but in the quiet, persistent way that lodged itself in her thoughts and refused to move. A file left incomplete. A detail that didn't quite align. A case that simply stopped making sense. Which was exactly why she was staring at Scott Williams' file for the third time that morning. She leaned back in her chair, one hand pressing lightly against her temple as if applying physical pressure might reorganize the facts into something logical. "It's not a case," she muttered. Across the desk, her assistant barely looked up from his laptop. "You say that like it's new information. Half of what you've gone through this week isn't a case." "No," Evelyn said, sharper now, tapping the folder with a measured, deliberate rhythm. "This one is different. This one shouldn't exist." That got his attention. He glanced up. "That's concerning." Evelyn let out a short breath, then leaned forward again, flipping the file open for what was probably the 10th time. "Contempt of court," she said, as if reciting the words might make them change. "Temporary detention pending compliance." Her assistant nodded. "Standard. Happens all the time." "For a few days," Evelyn said. There was a pause. "Maybe a couple weeks," he added cautiously. Evelyn tapped the page again. 7 years. Silence stretched across the office, thick enough to feel. "That's not," he began. "No," Evelyn cut in. "It's not." She pushed the file across the desk toward him. "No conviction. No sentencing beyond temporary detention. No follow-up hearings. No compliance resolution." Her assistant flipped through the pages, slower now, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to something closer to unease. "And no updates," he added quietly. "Not for over 5 years," Evelyn said. She stood abruptly, pacing once across the room before turning back, her arms crossing as she stared down at the folder like it had personally offended her. "This isn't a legal oversight," she said. "This is system failure." Her assistant hesitated. "Could it have just slipped through?" Evelyn gave him a look. "A man doesn't disappear into custody for 7 years because of paperwork," she said flatly. He winced slightly. "When you put it like that, how else should it be put?" She turned away from him before he could answer, her gaze drifting toward the window. The city stretched beyond it, busy and indifferent, functioning on rules and structures that people trusted without questioning. "Until something like this happened. Someone knew," she said quietly. "At some point, someone had to know." Her assistant didn't respond this time, because they both understood the uncomfortable truth. Knowing didn't always lead to action. Evelyn closed the file with a sharp snap. "I'm going to see him." Scott sat at the metal table, hands resting loosely in front of him, posture straight but not rigid. He wasn't nervous. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed. Most inmates reacted to her presence in predictable ways. Some were defensive. Some were desperate. Others performed a version of themselves they thought might earn sympathy. Scott Williams did none of those things. He simply looked at her, calmly, patiently, as though this meeting was just another part of his routine. "You're Scott Williams?" Evelyn asked, though she didn't need confirmation. "Yes." His voice matched his posture. Steady, neutral, controlled. Evelyn sat down across from him, placing the file on the table but not opening it immediately. For a moment, she studied him openly. The records described him as 38. He looked older, not dramatically, but in the subtle ways time left its mark when measured in monotony instead of experience. His frame was thinner than it probably once had been, his features sharper. His eyes were what unsettled her most. Not empty, not broken, just distant, like someone who had learned to exist without expectation. "You know why I'm here?" she asked. Scott shook his head once. "No." A simple answer. No guessing. No speculation. Evelyn tapped the file lightly. "I've been reviewing older cases. Yours came up." Scott nodded, as though that explained everything. "And?" he asked. The question caught her slightly off guard. "And?" she repeated, leaning forward now. "You've been held in contempt of court for 7 years without resolution." Scott considered that. Sounds accurate. There was no sarcasm in his tone. That bothered her more than if there had been. "You don't find that unusual?" Evelyn asked. Scott tilted his head slightly. "Unusual?" he echoed. "Yes." He thought for a moment, then said, "It wasn't the plan." Evelyn blinked. "That's one way to put it." Scott shrugged faintly. It became normal. She stared at him. 7 years. And this was how he talked about it. Not with resentment. Not with outrage. Just acceptance. Evelyn opened the file, flipping to a page she already knew by memory. "You were ordered to pay child support," she said. "You refused." "Yes." "You argued the order was unconstitutional." "Yes." "You were held in contempt." "Yes." Each answer came without hesitation, without emotion. "Why didn't you comply?" she asked. Scott met her gaze directly. Because it's wrong. There was that word again. Simple. Absolute. Evelyn leaned back slightly. The court didn't see it that way. Scott gave a faint, almost amused exhale. No, it didn't. She studied him carefully. You understand that agreeing now would resolve this, she said. You could walk out of here. There it was. The offer. The solution. The thing everyone before her had tried. Scott didn't even blink. No. Evelyn felt a flicker of frustration. You wouldn't need to stay here, she pressed. You've already? It doesn't matter how long I've been here, Scott interrupted calmly. She stopped. His tone hadn't changed, but there was something new in it. Certainty, sharpened. If I agree, he continued, then it becomes right. That's not how law works, she said. Scott tilted his head again, that same almost curious gesture. No? He asked. Evelyn hesitated, because suddenly that answer didn't feel as solid as it usually did. It's responsibility, she said instead. That isn't mine. It was determined by the court. And the court was wrong. The words weren't heeded, just stated, like a fact. Evelyn exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay measured. You're willing to stay here indefinitely over that belief? She asked. Scott held her gaze. Yes. There was no hesitation, no doubt, and no trace of regret. Evelyn stared at him, something shifting uncomfortably in her chest, because she had expected resistance, stubbornness, even anger. She had not expected this quiet, immovable certainty. You haven't had visitors in years, she said, flipping to another page. No legal representation. No appeals. Scott nodded once. That's correct. You didn't fight this. I did. Evelyn frowned. How? Scott gestured lightly around them. I refused. For a moment, she didn't know what to say, because somehow, irrationally, that answer made a kind of sense. Not legally, not practically, but fundamentally. Evelyn closed the file slowly. Mr. Williams, she said, her voice more measured now. What do you expect to happen? Scott was quiet for a moment. Then he said, nothing. The simplicity of it landed harder than anything else he had said. Nothing? She repeated. He nodded. I don't expect the system to fix itself, he said. I just won't help it do something wrong. Evelyn stared at him, and for the first time since she'd opened his file, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not frustration, not disbelief, something far more inconvenient. Respect. She pushed her chair back, standing slowly. I'll be reviewing this further, she said, her tone returning to professional neutrality. Scott inclined his head slightly. Understood. Evelyn hesitated just for a fraction of a second. Then she asked, if nothing changes, would you still refuse? Scott didn't need time to think. Yes. That unwavering certainty again. Evelyn nodded once, more to herself than to him. Then I guess I'll have to find something that does change. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even a plan. But it was the most honest thing she had said since walking into the room. Scott watched her as she turned toward the door, and for the first time in years, something unfamiliar stirred beneath the steady calm of his thoughts. Not hope. He didn't allow himself that. But something adjacent. Curiosity. As the door closed behind her, Scott sat back down, his hands returning to their usual place. Routine. Familiar. Contained. And yet, for the first time in a very long time, the routine felt slightly off. Chapter 3, Unavoidable Conversations. Scott expected not to see her again. Experience had taught him that most people arrived with purpose and left with conclusions already formed. They came in convinced they could solve him, explain him, or correct him. And when none of those things happened, they moved on. It was efficient that way. Clean. Predictable. So when the guard stopped outside his cell 3 days later and said, Williams, visitor, Scott actually glanced up in mild surprise. Randall, lingering nearby, let out a low whistle. You're getting popular. Scott stood without responding, though inwardly he felt that same unfamiliar shift, the faint disturbance of routine. Same one? Scott asked the guard. The man shrugged. Yeah, the determined one. Scott almost smiled at that. Evelyn Carter had told herself this was procedural. That was the official justification. Follow-up, clarification, due diligence. Sounded neat, professional, necessary. It also wasn't entirely true. She sat at the table again, the same file in front of her, though she didn't open it this time. She didn't need to. She knew every page, every gap, every omission. What she didn't know, what she found herself thinking about at inconvenient times, was the man attached to it. Scott entered a moment later, escorted in with the same quiet composure as before. He sat across from her without prompting, hands folding loosely together, posture unchanged. Calm. Always calm. You came back, he said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn raised an eyebrow slightly. You sound surprised. I expected you to move on, he replied. Because that's what people do? Scott considered that. Yes. Evelyn tapped the edge of the table lightly. I don't like unfinished things. Scott nodded faintly. That explains it. Something about the ease of that response caught her off guard. You don't seem particularly concerned, she noted. Scott tilted his head. About you returning? Yes. He thought about it for a moment. Concern requires expectation. And you don't have any. Not about this. Evelyn leaned back slightly, studying him again. You know, she said, most people in your position would be pushing me for answers. Scott gave a faint shrug. Most people haven't been here 7 years. Fair point, she admitted. There was a brief pause, not uncomfortable but different this time. Less like distance and more like space. Evelyn broke it first. I spoke to the judge who handled your case. Scott's expression didn't change. I assumed you would. He didn't know you were still here. That did get a reaction. Not visibly dramatic, but something shifted behind Scott's eyes. A flicker of acknowledgement. That's consistent, he said. With what? The system forgetting. Evelyn frowned slightly. You say that like it's inevitable. Scott met her gaze. Isn't it? She started to answer, then stopped. Because the honest answer was more complicated than she wanted it to be. I'm working on correcting it, she said instead. Scott nodded once. No visible relief. No gratitude. Just acceptance of the statement as information. That's your job, he said. Evelyn felt a flicker of irritation. You could at least pretend to be invested. Scott considered that. Would that help? He asked. The question was genuine. That somehow made it worse. Evelyn exhaled slowly. No, probably not. Silence again. But not the same silence as before. This one had edges, curiosity pressing in from both sides. You don't ask many questions, Evelyn observed. Scott gave a faint smile. Answers are unreliable. That's a convenient philosophy. It's an efficient one. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. Then why talk at all? Scott glanced at her, the faint smile lingering. Because silence makes people uncomfortable. And this doesn't? It's different. She couldn't argue with that. Another pause. Then Evelyn said, What did you do before all this? Scott blinked once, as if the question had come from an unexpected direction. Before? He repeated. Yes, your life. Scott leaned back slightly, considering. I worked in logistics, he said. Supply chain management. Evelyn nodded. That sounds organized. It was predictable, Scott replied. Systems, processes, clear outcomes. And you liked that. I understood it. Evelyn's mouth curved slightly. Important distinction. Scott returned the faint smile. It is. She flipped open the file absent-mindedly, though again her eyes didn't focus on it. You were married 3 years. Scott's expression stilled. Not closed, but quieter. Yes. You don't talk about it. It's not relevant. Evelyn looked up at him. It's why you're here. Scott's gaze shifted slightly, not away, but inward. For the system, he said. Not for me. Evelyn tilted her head. Explain that. Scott took a moment before answering. The situation created the case, he said. The case created the decision. The decision created this. He gestured lightly around them. But none of that changes the principle. And the principle matters more than everything else? Yes. Evelyn studied him carefully. You don't sound angry, she said. I was. What happened? Scott gave a small, almost amused exhale. It didn't help anything. So you just stopped? I adjusted. Evelyn shook her head slightly. You make that sound easy. Scott met her gaze. It wasn't. There it was. A crack, not in his composure, but in the neat simplicity he usually presented. Evelyn noticed. So what kept you going? She asked softly. Scott hesitated. Not long, but long enough to matter. Consistency, he said finally. That's not an answer. It is for me. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. 7 years requires more than consistency. Scott looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, routine. She almost groaned. That's worse. Scott's faint smile returned, just a little more visible this time. It's practical. It's evasive. It's sufficient. Evelyn shook her head, leaning back again. You are objectively one of the most frustrating people I've ever met. And yet, Scott said mildly, you came back. She opened her mouth, then paused. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a short burst of genuine amusement that seemed to surprise both of them. Scott blinked, clearly not expecting that reaction. That wasn't supposed to be funny, he said. It wasn't, Evelyn replied, still smiling slightly. That's why it is. Scott studied her. You laugh easily, he observed. Evelyn shrugged. Occupational hazard. If I don't, I start throwing things. That seems less efficient. It's more satisfying. Scott considered that. I'll take your word for it. Another pause. But now something had shifted. The conversation felt lighter. Not superficial, but no longer anchored purely in opposition. Evelyn glanced at him, then said, You know, you're not what I expected. Scott raised an eyebrow slightly. In what way? I expected more resistance, she said. More anger. More something. Scott nodded faintly. That phase passed. And this is better? It's quieter. Evelyn studied him again. And lonelier, she added. Scott didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was even. Those often overlap. Evelyn looked down at the file for a moment, then closed it again with a soft tap. I'm going to keep working on your case, she said. Scott nodded. Understood. She hesitated. Then, almost casually, she added, I'll probably come back again. Scott tilted his head slightly. Why? He asked. It wasn't suspicious. Just curious. Evelyn met his gaze, something thoughtful in her expression. Because, she said, you're an unfinished thing. Scott absorbed that. Then, slowly, a faint smile appeared. Genuine this time, subtle but unmistakable. That sounds like your problem, he said. Evelyn stood, shaking her head as she turned toward the door. It probably is. As she left, Scott remained seated for a moment longer than usual. The room was quiet again, routine waiting to reassert itself. But something lingered. Not hope, not expectation. Something else. Something inconvenient. As he finally stood to leave, Scott found himself thinking, not about the system or the past or even the years ahead, but about the next time she might walk through that door. And for the first time in a long time, the thought didn't feel irrelevant. Chapter 4: Paperwork and Panic. Evelyn Carter had never considered paperwork an enemy. It had always been a tool. A weapon, even structured, precise, and obedient if handled correctly. Files told stories. Systems created order. Laws defined boundaries. Until now. Now, she stood in the middle of her office, staring at a stack of folders that refused to cooperate with the narrative she needed them to tell. This is ridiculous, she muttered. Her assistant, who had learned to interpret her tone with alarming accuracy, didn't look up immediately. Ridiculous as in complicated, he said carefully. Or ridiculous as in I'm about to schedule a meeting that ruins everyone's afternoon? Evelyn crossed her arms. Both. That got his attention. He looked up, wary. What's the issue? She picked up Scott's file and dropped it onto his desk. Not aggressively, but with enough force to make a point. The issue, she said, is that fixing this requires acknowledging that multiple people failed for years. He scanned the file briefly. Isn't that already obvious? Yes, Evelyn said. But admitting it officially means liability. Internal review. External review. Possibly headlines. Her assistant winced. Ah, that kind of problem. Evelyn began pacing again. The longer we take, the worse it looks, she said. But the faster we move, the more questions we invite. You mean the kind we should be asking anyway? She stopped, giving him a brief, pointed look. Yes, she admitted. But institutions don't enjoy interrogating themselves. He leaned back slightly. So what's your move? Evelyn hesitated. Then she said something she hadn't expected to say out loud. I go around it. Her assistant blinked. Around it? I fix the immediate problem first, she clarified. Then deal with the fallout. That sounds suspiciously like a plan. It's not a good one, she said. It doesn't have to be good, he replied. It just has to work. Evelyn picked up the file again, staring at Scott's name printed neatly across the tab. 7 years. A small mistake would have been understandable. A few weeks, even months, still unacceptable but human. This was something else. I'm going to see him again, she said. Her assistant raised an eyebrow. That's becoming a pattern. Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, then paused. It's part of the process, she said, slightly less convincingly than before. Of course it is. She ignored the tone. Scott had started noticing the time between her visits. He didn't track it precisely. That habit had long since faded, but he felt it. The rhythm of expectation. Unwanted but present. And when it stretched longer than before, something else crept in. Not concern. Not quite disappointment. More like awareness. Which was why, when the guard called his name again nearly a week later, Scott stood immediately. Randall watched from his usual position, smirking. You sure you're not running for office? Scott didn't break stride. No speeches involved. That's the only reason you wouldn't win. Scott allowed the faintest hint of a smile as he stepped into the hallway. Evelyn was already seated when he entered this time. The file was open in front of her, pages slightly disorganized. A subtle but telling departure from her usual precision. Scott noticed. You look like your system isn't cooperating, he said as he sat down. Evelyn glanced up, momentarily caught off guard. Then she narrowed her eyes slightly. You're getting observant. I had time to practice. She leaned back, exhaling slowly. You're not wrong. Scott tilted his head. What changed? Evelyn hesitated, then said, nothing. She held up a hand before he could respond. That's the problem, she added. Scott considered that, then nodded faintly. That's consistent. Evelyn gave a short, humorless laugh. You have an answer for everything, don't you? No, Scott said. Just patterns. She tapped the file. Here's one. Fixing your situation isn't as simple as it should be. Scott's expression didn't change. I assumed it wouldn't be. Something about that irritated her again. Not because he was wrong, but because he was so prepared for that answer. You've been held without proper oversight for years, she said. There are procedures for correcting that. Reviews, approvals, documentation. Time, Scott said. Evelyn stopped. Yes, she admitted. Time. Scott nodded. The system moves at its own pace. You say that like it's acceptable. It's predictable. Evelyn leaned forward, frustration surfacing more openly now. Well, I don't find it acceptable, she said. And I don't intend to follow the usual pace. Scott studied her. And what does that look like? He asked. Evelyn paused. Then slowly she smiled. Not the polite, professional smile she wore in court, but something sharper. Creative problem solving, she said. Scott blinked. That sounds like a euphemism. It is. For what? Evelyn leaned back, folding her arms. For doing what's necessary before someone tells me I can't. Scott watched her for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he let out a soft laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was the first time she had heard it. That seems inefficient, he said. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. You're criticizing my efficiency? I'm observing your risk tolerance. She smirked slightly. And, it's higher than I expected. Evelyn tilted her head. You didn't expect me to take risks. I expected you to follow the system. I am following it, she said. Scott gave her a look. Evelyn amended. Just, not the parts that delay results. Scott considered that carefully. That's still the system, he said. It's the version I prefer. Another pause settled between them, but this time it held something lighter, almost playful. You're smiling more, Evelyn noted. Scott seemed mildly surprised by that observation. Am I? Yes. He thought about it. It might be your influence. Evelyn laughed. That sounds dangerously like blame. It's an observation, he replied. Convenient distinction. It's an efficient one. She shook her head, the smile lingering. You're impossible, she said. And yet, Scott replied. You keep coming back. Evelyn opened her mouth, then stopped. Then, slowly, she leaned forward again. Let me ask you something, she said. Scott nodded once. If I get you out of here, she said. What then? The question lingered in the air longer than either of them expected. Scott didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't understand the question, but because, for the first time in years, he didn't already have an answer. Evelyn noticed. You haven't thought about it, she said quietly. Scott's gaze shifted slightly, thoughtful now, less distant. No, he admitted. That's surprising. It wasn't relevant. And now, Scott looked back at her. Now it might be. The simplicity of that landed harder than either of them expected. Evelyn leaned back slowly, studying him. You'll have to decide, she said. Scott nodded faintly. Yes, and you don't like uncertainty. I prefer clarity. Evelyn smiled slightly. You might not get it. Scott held her gaze. That's new. She hesitated, then asked, Does that bother you? Scott considered the question carefully. Then he said something that surprised even him. Less than I expected. Evelyn didn't respond immediately, because something about that answer felt important. Not dramatic, not obvious, but meaningful. She closed the file slowly, her expression shifting back towards something more neutral. I'm making progress, she said. It's just slower than I want. Scott nodded. I understand. And you're okay with that. It doesn't change anything. Evelyn stood. She hesitated again, just slightly. Then she said, I'll come back soon. Scott tilted his head. You don't have to say that, he said. Evelyn met his gaze directly. I know. She turned and walked toward the door. For once, Scott watched her leave, not out of habit, but because he wanted to. When the door closed behind her, the room returned to its usual silence. Routine waited, predictable, contained. And yet, Scott remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. Because now, alongside routine, there was something else. Not hope, not yet, but possibility. And that, he realized as he finally stood to leave, was far more unsettling. Chapter 5 Release, the paperwork, when it finally moved, did not do so gracefully. It lurched. It resisted. It attempted, at several critical points, to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Evelyn discovered quickly that correcting a mistake of this magnitude wasn't simply about issuing an order. It was about navigating a maze of approvals, signatures, and people who suddenly found themselves very interested in not being associated with the error. She signed things she shouldn't have needed to sign. She argued points that should have been uncontested. At one point, she very nearly threatened a department meeting with the phrase public disclosure, which had proven, unsurprisingly, effective. 3 days later, she stood outside the intake office of the detention facility, holding a single sheet of paper that should have existed years ago. Immediate release, the officer at the desk read aloud, squinting at the document. Yes, Evelyn said evenly. Immediate. The officer glanced up at her. For contempt. Yes. For 7. He stopped himself, shaking his head slightly. Never mind. Evelyn crossed her arms lightly. That's probably best. He stood, taking the paper with him. I'll process it. Evelyn watched him go, her expression calm on the surface. Underneath, something else churned. Not doubt. Not exactly. More like anticipation edged with uncertainty. This was the moment where theory met reality. Fixing the system was one thing. What came after, that was less predictable. Scott wasn't expecting a visitor that day. The routine had settled into its usual quiet rhythm, the hours stretching and folding into themselves without distinction. He had just sat down after lunch when the guard appeared again, keys jangling in a familiar pattern. Williams, Scott stood. Yeah. The guard hesitated, just slightly. That DA of yours, he said. Scott tilted his head. Yes. She didn't come to talk. Something in the phrasing shifted the air. Scott felt it immediately. What does that mean? He asked. The guard gestured toward the hallway. Come on. No explanation. No elaboration. Just movement. Scott followed. The walk felt the same as always. The same walls, the same turns, the same faint hum of fluorescent lights, but something about it sat differently in his chest. Uncertain. When they reached the processing area, Scott saw her immediately. Evelyn stood near the desk, the same composed posture, though there was a tension in her shoulders he hadn't seen before. She looked up as he entered. Their eyes met. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Scott said, "You look like something changed." Evelyn exhaled once, steadying herself. It did. That was all she said at first. The officer returned, holding a set of forms and, more notably, a small plastic bag. Personal effects. Scott's gaze flicked to it, then back to her. Explain, he said. Evelyn stepped closer, her tone careful but direct. You're being released, she said. The words hung there, simple, clear, and completely disconnected from anything Scott had allowed himself to imagine. He didn't react, not immediately, not visibly. You shouldn't have been here this long, Evelyn continued. The order was never meant to be indefinite. There was no follow-up, no review. It was missed. Missed, Scott repeated. Evelyn didn't look away. Yes, Scott let that settle. 7 years reduced to a single word. Missed. He almost smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. And now it's not, he said. No. Another pause. Then Scott asked, what happens next? Evelyn hesitated, because she realized suddenly and uncomfortably that she didn't have a structured, procedural answer for that. You walk out, she said. Scott nodded slowly, as if processing that not as an instruction, but as a concept. Just like that. Just like that. Scott glanced at the plastic bag again. And the original issue? Evelyn met his gaze. It's unresolved, she said. But the contempt order can't hold you indefinitely. That part is over. Scott studied her carefully. So nothing changes, he said. Evelyn shook her head. Something changes. What? You're not in a cell anymore. Scott considered that. It should have felt like victory. Didn't. Felt like absence. The removal of something that had defined his world for so long that its absence left a quiet, unfamiliar space behind. The officer cleared his throat, holding out the bag. Sign here. Scott stepped forward, taking the pen automatically. Routine. Even this felt like routine. He signed his name, handed the pen back, took the bag. Inside were the fragments of a past life, wallet, keys, a phone that no longer had relevance, the small, ordinary objects of a man who had once existed outside these walls. He stared at them for a moment, then looked up again. Evelyn hadn't moved. You made this happen, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even quite a question. Partially, she said. That's an inefficient level of credit. Evelyn couldn't help it. She smiled. Occupational hazard. Scott nodded faintly. Thank you. The words sounded strange coming from him. Unpracticed, but genuine. Evelyn's expression softened slightly. You don't owe me that, she said. Scott tilted his head. I don't owe you anything. And yet, he echoed. They stood there for a moment, suspended between something formal and something not. The officer gestured toward the exit. Whenever you're ready. Scott turned toward the door. The door. A simple thing. Metal. Hinged. Functional. He had passed through dozens of doors like it. But this one was different. He paused just before it. Evelyn stepped closer, her voice quieter now. You don't have to figure everything out right away, she said. Scott glanced at her. That's not how I usually approach things. I figured. A faint smile touched his expression. I'll adjust. Evelyn nodded. Good. Another pause. Then, without overthinking it, she added, Do you have somewhere to go? Scott opened his mouth, then stopped, because the answer that had once been obvious no longer applied. He started. And for the first time since she had met him, Scott Williams hesitated. Evelyn saw it. Really saw it. And something in her expression shifted. Not professional, not distant, human. That's okay, she said gently. You can take a minute. Scott let out a slow breath. A minute seems insufficient, he said. Evelyn smiled, softer this time. Then take more than one. Scott looked at the door again. then back at her, and then finally he stepped forward. The door opened. Light spilled through in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just open. Scott crossed the threshold slowly, not rushing, not lingering, just moving. And as the door closed behind him, for the first time in 7 years, there was no cell waiting on the other side. Only space, only possibility, and, standing a few steps beside him on the outside, Evelyn Carter. Watching, waiting, not with answers, but with something that felt unexpectedly like a beginning. Chapter 6, Learning to Live, Freedom, Scott discovered, was louder than he expected. It wasn't the dramatic kind. No swelling music, no overwhelming rush of emotion. Instead, it came in small, persistent sensations that refused to be ignored. The hum of traffic, the chatter of people passing by, the subtle, constant motion of a world that had continued without him. He stood just outside the facility for a long moment after the door closed behind him, his hand still loosely gripping the plastic bag containing what remained of his past life. Cars passed. Someone laughed somewhere nearby. A bird cut across the sky overhead. It was ordinary. That was the problem. After 7 years of confinement, ordinary felt disorienting. You're thinking too much. Scott glanced to his right. Evelyn stood beside him, hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, watching him with a kind of quiet attention that felt neither intrusive nor impatient. I usually am, Scott said. I figured. He looked back out at the street. There are too many variables, he added. Evelyn smiled faintly. You'll survive. That's what people keep saying. And yet, here you are. Scott tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the point. That remains to be seen. Evelyn studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the parking lot. Do you want a ride? Scott hesitated. The hesitation wasn't about her, it was about the concept. Accepting help, accepting direction, accepting anything that wasn't entirely within his control. I don't have a destination, he said. That makes it easier, she replied. Scott glanced at her. How? We can pick one. There was a simplicity in the way she said it that felt almost foreign. Scott considered it. Then, after a moment, he nodded. That seems efficient. Evelyn smiled. It's one of my better skills. Her car was clean, organized in a way that matched her personality. Nothing out of place, nothing excessive. Scott sat in the passenger seat, the door shutting with a solid, unfamiliar sound. He ran his fingers briefly along the fabric of the seat, grounding himself in the sensation. Evelyn glanced at him but didn't comment. She started the engine. So, she said, pulling out of the lot, let's start with something simple. Scott looked at her. Define simple. Food, she said. Scott blinked. That's your first choice? I assume you'd like to eat something that didn't come from a tray. Scott considered that. He couldn't argue with it. That's a reasonable assumption. Evelyn nodded. I try to make those. There was a small restaurant not far away. Nothing fancy, just a quiet place with large windows and the kind of atmosphere that didn't demand attention. Scott paused at the entrance. You've been in a building before, Evelyn said lightly. Yes, he replied. Not by choice. She smiled. Fair. He stepped inside. The shift was immediate. Warm light, the sound of quiet conversation, the faint clatter of dishes, felt close. Not confined, but contained in a way that was suddenly hard to process. You okay? Evelyn asked. Scott nodded once. Adjusting. They were seated quickly. A menu was placed in front of him. Scott stared at it. It wasn't complex. It wasn't overwhelming. But it required something he hadn't needed in years. Choice. Evelyn watched him, her expression softening slightly. You don't have to optimize it, she said. Scott glanced up. That's inefficient. This isn't a logistics problem, she replied. Scott looked back at the menu. That's debatable. Evelyn laughed quietly. Pick something, she said. If you hate it, you can blame me. Scott considered that. Assigning responsibility already? It's one of my lesser skills. Scott's mouth twitched faintly. After another moment, he pointed to something at random. That. Evelyn nodded approvingly. Bold strategy. It minimizes delay. The waiter took their order, and for a moment they simply sat there. Not in silence, but in something quieter. Pause that didn't feel empty. Scott rested his hands on the table, glancing occasionally at the people around them. They're loud, he said. Evelyn followed his gaze. They're talking. It's the same thing. She smiled slightly. You'll get used to it. Scott didn't respond right away. When he did, it was softer. I used to be used to it. Evelyn looked back at him. That'll come back. Scott met her eyes. You're very certain about that. I'm choosing to be. Scott considered that. That seems inefficient. It's called optimism. I've read about it. Evelyn laughed again, shaking her head. You're going to have to try it at some point. Scott thought for a moment. Maybe in controlled conditions. That's a start. Their food arrived not long after. Scott studied the plate for a moment before picking up his fork. The first bite was different. Not better. Not worse. Just new. He chewed slowly, processing not just the taste, but the experience. Evelyn didn't interrupt, letting him adjust in his own time. Finally, Scott said, "This is acceptable." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "High praise. I'm calibrating expectations." "Of course you are." They ate for a few minutes before Evelyn spoke again. "Do you have any plans?" she asked. Scott shook his head. "Not yet. No job. No place to stay." "Correct. That doesn't concern you?" Scott paused. "It should," he admitted. But I haven't decided how to approach it." Evelyn leaned back slightly. "That might be the most honest answer you've given me." Scott glanced at her. "I try to avoid unnecessary honesty." "Why?" "It complicates things." Evelyn smiled faintly. "It also makes them real." Scott considered that, then looked back down at his plate. "That remains to be evaluated." There was another pause, not awkward, just thoughtful. Then Evelyn said, more casually, "You can stay somewhere temporarily." Scott looked up. "That sounds like a logistical suggestion." "It is. And what's the cost?" Evelyn held his gaze. "There isn't one." Scott frowned slightly. "That's unlikely." "It's true." Scott tilted his head. "That introduces imbalance." Evelyn smiled. "You really can't accept anything without analyzing it, can you?" "It's habit." "Well," she said, leaning forward slightly, "try accepting this as a temporary solution. You can figure out balance later." Scott studied her carefully. "You're persistent," he said. "I've been told that." Another moment passed. Then slowly Scott nodded. "Temporarily," he said. Evelyn smiled, fully this time. "Temporarily," she agreed. Scott returned to his food, quieter now. But something had shifted. Not in a dramatic way. Not all at once. Just slightly. Because for the first time since he had walked out of that facility, he wasn't evaluating everything as a problem to solve. Somewhere between the unfamiliar noise of the world and the steady presence across the table, Scott Williams began, cautiously, to participate in it again. Chapter 7: Risk. Scott had always believed that risk was best avoided. Not eliminated, that would be inefficient, but minimized, contained, calculated to the point where uncertainty became irrelevant. It was how he had lived his life before everything unraveled. Systems, structures, decisions made with clarity and intention. And yet, standing in Evelyn Carter's living room 3 days after his release, Scott realized with a quiet, reluctant clarity that he had entered into a situation he had not fully calculated. He held a mug of coffee in his hands, staring at it as though the answer might be somewhere in the surface. "You're analyzing the coffee," Evelyn said from the kitchen doorway. Scott didn't look up. "I'm analyzing the temperature. I made it 5 minutes ago." "That's useful information." Evelyn leaned against the frame, arms crossed, watching him with a faint smile. "You've done that 3 times already," she added. Scott glanced up. "What?" Paused mid-thought, like the universe forgot to update your processing speed. Scott considered that. "That's a possibility." Evelyn laughed softly. "You don't ease into things, do you?" Scott shook his head. "Easing implies gradual adjustment. This is abrupt." "That's fair." He looked around the room again. Her place was comfortable, lived in, but organized in a way that reflected her personality. Bookshelves lined one wall, not perfectly arranged but clearly intentional. A coat draped over a chair suggested movement, activity, life. Felt normal, which was still the strangest part. "You don't have to sit there like a guest," Evelyn said. Scott blinked. "I am a guest. Yes, but not a formal one." "That distinction lacks clarity." Evelyn pushed off the doorway and walked into the room, dropping onto the opposite end of the couch with a casual ease that contrasted sharply with his stillness. "It means you can relax," she said. Scott looked at her. "I don't know how to do that here," he said, matter of fact. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay," she said. "New plan." Scott tilted his head. "Define plan." "I teach you how to do normal," she said. Scott frowned slightly. "That sounds inefficient." "It's the opposite," she countered. "It saves time in the long run." Scott considered that, then nodded faintly. "I'll evaluate the outcome." "Of course you will." There was a small pause. Then Evelyn leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "Let's start simple," she said. "What's the first thing you want to figure out?" Scott opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. Not because he didn't understand the question. Because for the first time, the answer wasn't obvious. Evelyn noticed immediately. "That's new," she said quietly. Scott nodded once. "Yes." "Does it bother you?" He thought about it. "Not as much as it probably should." Evelyn smiled slightly. "Progress." Scott glanced at her. "You define progress differently than I do." "I define it as movement," she said. "You define it as control." Scott didn't argue, because she wasn't wrong. Another moment passed. Then Evelyn said, more casually this time, "Do you ever think about what comes after all this?" Scott looked at her. "That's a broad question." "It's meant to be." He leaned back slightly, setting the coffee on the table. "I used to," he said. "Before. And now." Scott hesitated. Then, slowly, he said, "Now it feels undefined." Evelyn nodded. "That's not a bad thing." Scott raised an eyebrow. "Uncertainty is rarely beneficial. Depends on what you do with it." Scott studied her carefully. "And what would you suggest?" Evelyn held his gaze. "Take a risk." The word landed heavier than expected. Scott didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Define risk," he said. Evelyn smiled faintly. "You really need definitions for everything. It improves outcomes." She nodded. "Fine. Risk. Doing something without knowing exactly how it's going to turn out." Scott considered that, then said, "That sounds like inefficiency." Evelyn laughed. "It sounds like living." Scott held her gaze. "That's subjective. Most important things are." There was a beat of silence. Then Evelyn added, almost lightly, "Like trust." Scott's expression stilled. "Trust," he repeated. "Yes." He leaned back again, his posture shifting slightly, less rigid but more guarded. "That's a variable I typically avoid." "I noticed." Evelyn's tone softened, just slightly. "You trusted me enough to come here." Scott hesitated, then said, "That was a calculated decision." Evelyn nodded. "And?" Scott looked at her. "And it involved risk." She smiled. "There you go." Scott exhaled slowly, considering that. "I don't prefer it." "No one does," Evelyn said. "That's why it counts." There was another pause, longer this time, but not empty. Then, unexpectedly, Scott said, "There's something I don't understand." Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "What?" Scott hesitated, not out of uncertainty but because the question itself felt unfamiliar. "You keep coming back," he said. Evelyn blinked. "That's your question?" "Yes." She smiled faintly. "I've answered that before." "You said I was unfinished," Scott replied. "And you are." Scott shook his head slightly. "That's not sufficient." Evelyn studied him carefully. "Why isn't it?" she asked. Scott met her gaze. "Because it doesn't explain the consistency." For a moment, Evelyn didn't answer. Because the question, simple as it sounded, wasn't. And he deserved a real answer. "Okay," she said finally. She shifted slightly, leaning back but not breaking eye contact. "I keep coming back," she said. "Because you're different." Scott frowned. "That's vague." Evelyn smiled. "You're not like anyone else I've met." "That's statistically unlikely." "That's observationally accurate." Scott almost smiled at that. "Continue," he said. Evelyn hesitated, then said, "You don't bend." Scott's expression shifted slightly, more inward now. "That's caused problems." "Yes," she said. "It has." Another pause. Then she added, more quietly, "But it's also rare." Scott didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was softer than before. "It's also isolating." Evelyn nodded. "I know." He looked at her again. "Then why engage with it?" Evelyn held his gaze. "Because I don't think you're meant to stay isolated." The words settled between them, heavier than anything else that had been said so far. Scott felt it. The shift. The change in direction. This was no longer abstract. No longer purely theoretical. "You're making assumptions," he said. Evelyn nodded once. "I am. That introduces risk." "I know." Scott studied her carefully. "And you're okay with that?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "I told you. I'm good at taking risks." Another silence followed. But this one was different, because now both of them were aware of it. Scott leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table again. "Hypothetically," he said. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Of course it's hypothetical." "For now," Scott clarified. She nodded. "Go on." "If I were to take a risk," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, "what would that look like?" Evelyn's expression softened, just slightly. "It would look like not overthinking the next thing you say." Scott blinked once. "That's inefficient." Evelyn smiled. "Try it anyway." Scott hesitated. And for the first time since she had met him, he didn't calculate the outcome. He didn't map the variables. He didn't structure the response into something controlled. Instead, he simply said, "I don't mind being here." The words were quiet, simple, but entirely unfiltered. Evelyn blinked, then smiled, genuine, unguarded. "That's a good start," she said. Scott let out a slow breath. That felt imprecise. It felt honest. Scott considered that. Then slowly he nodded. "Those might not be mutually exclusive." Evelyn leaned back slightly, her smile lingering. "Now you're learning." Scott looked at her. And for a moment, the uncertainty didn't feel like something to avoid. It felt like something to explore. Carefully, deliberately, but genuinely. And as the conversation shifted again, lighter now but carrying that quiet, unspoken awareness beneath it, Scott Williams realized something that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. Risk, he thought, might not always be something to eliminate. Sometimes it might be something worth choosing. Chapter 8 Forward. Scott discovered that moving forward did not feel like motion. It felt like hesitation layered over possibility, like standing at the edge of something unmeasured and deciding, repeatedly, whether or not to take another step. 3 weeks after his release, he stood in Evelyn's kitchen watching her attempt to open a jar with unnecessary determination. "You're applying force inefficiently," he said. Evelyn didn't look up. "I'm applying force emotionally. That's not a recognized method. It is in this kitchen." Scott leaned slightly against the counter, arms loosely crossed. "You could use a grip cloth," he suggested. Evelyn twisted the lid again, muttering under her breath. "Or I could win on principle." Scott paused. Then, lightly, almost experimentally, he stepped forward. "May I?" he asked. Evelyn glanced at him, then handed over the jar without comment. "Try not to make it look too easy." Scott considered the lid for a moment, adjusted his grip, and twisted. It opened. Evelyn narrowed her eyes. "I don't like you right now." Scott set the lid down carefully. That outcome was predictable. She took the jar back, shaking her head as she moved toward the counter again. "You've gotten smug. I've gotten accurate. That's worse." Scott allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. It was a new development. Not the expression itself, but how often it happened without deliberate intention. Something had shifted in the weeks since he'd left the facility. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. He had found a temporary job, logistics, of course. Not the same as before, but close enough to feel familiar. Structure helped. So did routine, though now it extended beyond a confined space. He had opened a new bank account, learned how outdated his phone was, spent an inordinate amount of time staring at grocery store shelves like they contained hidden complexities. Each step had felt small. Each one oddly mattered. And through all of it, Evelyn remained. Not constantly, not intrusively, but consistently. He noticed patterns. She called when she said she would. She showed up when she said she would. She challenged him when it was necessary. And, more confusingly, she stayed without requiring justification. Scott leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the counter. "I've been evaluating something," he said. Evelyn glanced at him, instantly alert to the phrasing. "That sounds serious." "It's a process." "That's even worse." Scott ignored that. "The concept of balance," he continued. Evelyn set the jar down, turning to face him fully now. "All right," she said. "Let's hear it." Scott hesitated briefly, organizing the thought. Not perfectly, but enough. "When you first offered assistance," he said, "I noted the imbalance created by receiving something without returning equivalent value." Evelyn nodded slowly. "You did. I've been analyzing that assumption." "And?" Scott met her gaze. "It may have been incomplete." Evelyn blinked. "That's a big admission for you." Scott inclined his head slightly. "I'm capable of revision." "Apparently." He paused again, then continued more deliberately. "Balance may not require immediate equivalence," he said. Evelyn's expression softened, just slightly. "No," she said quietly. "It usually doesn't." Scott nodded. "There may be delayed reciprocation, or different forms of value." Evelyn smiled faintly. "You're expanding your model. That seems necessary." Another pause settled between them, but this one was warm, not uncertain, not guarded, just present. Evelyn leaned against the counter, studying him. "You've changed," she said. Scott considered that. "Define changed," he replied. Evelyn smiled. "Slightly less impossible to talk to." "That's a vague metric." "It's accurate." Scott allowed that. Then, after a moment, he said, "You didn't." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Didn't what?" "Change." She thought about it. "I probably did," she admitted. "But I had less ground to cover." Scott nodded faintly. "That's consistent." Evelyn laughed softly, shaking her head. "You know," she said, "most people would have run in the opposite direction after everything you went through." Scott's expression shifted, quieter now. "I considered it. And," he looked at her, "and I decided not to." Evelyn held his gaze. "Why?" Scott hesitated. The question wasn't difficult, but the answer required something he still wasn't entirely comfortable with. Honesty without structure, without calculation, without layers. He exhaled slowly. "Because," he said, "not everything should be avoided." Evelyn didn't interrupt. Scott continued, carefully but without overthinking it this time. "Some things." He paused, adjusting slightly. "Some things may be worth the risk." Evelyn's expression softened fully now, something warm and unmistakable behind it. "That's a big step," she said. Scott nodded once. "It is." Another pause. Then Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "So," she said, her tone lighter now but carrying something underneath it. "What kind of risk are we talking about?" Scott looked at her. Really looked. And for once, he didn't try to define it first. "I don't know," he said. Evelyn smiled faintly. "That's even bigger." Scott almost smiled. "I've noticed." She pushed off the counter, stepping a little closer. Not too close, just enough to shift the air between them. "Well," she said, "you're not alone in it." Scott's gaze remained steady. "That reduces uncertainty." It doesn't eliminate it. I'm aware. Evelyn folded her arms loosely. So what now? Scott paused. Not long. Just enough to recognize that the question no longer felt overwhelming. Felt open. Now, he said. We continue. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Very specific. It's flexible. I'm impressed. Scott nodded once. That's reasonable. Evelyn laughed again. Easy, natural, unforced. You're still you, she said. Scott considered that carefully. Yes, he said. Just adjusted. Evelyn met his gaze. Good, she said softly. Neither of them moved for a moment. The space between them wasn't empty. It held everything unsaid but not unresolved. Scott shifted slightly, picking up the jar lid and placing it back on with quiet precision. Then he looked at her again. And this time there was no hesitation. Would you like to go out? He asked. Evelyn blinked. Out? Yes. She smiled slowly. That sounds suspiciously like a normal question. I'm testing the method. Evelyn tilted her head, amused. And the purpose? Scott thought about it, then said simply, to continue. Evelyn's smile widened. That's a good purpose. She grabbed her coat from the chair, slipping it on as she headed toward the door. Come on, she said. Scott followed. Not out of routine, not out of obligation, but because, for the first time in a long time, forward wasn't something he had to force. It was something he chose. And as the door closed behind them, the world waiting outside just as unpredictable and unstructured as before, Scott Williams stepped into it without needing certainty. Because now he had something better. Not answers, not control, but connection. And, unexpectedly, that was enough. Epilogue, 2 years later, Scott Williams no longer measured time in survival. He measured it in continuations. The rhythm of his life had settled into something that resembled, not the rigid structure he once depended on, but a quieter, more adaptable balance. Days were still organized. Plans still existed. Systems, in his mind, still mattered. But now they made room for change. He stood in front of a wide glass window in his office, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the city below. The reflection staring back at him would have been unfamiliar to the man he used to be. Not just because of time, because of difference. You're doing it again. Evelyn's voice came from behind him. Scott didn't turn immediately. Doing what? He asked, staring at the view like it's going to give you a quarterly report. Scott smiled faintly, the expression almost automatic now. I was evaluating the lighting conditions. Of course you were. He finally turned. Evelyn leaned casually against his office doorway, arms folded, her expression warm but amused in a way that had become completely familiar. She looked the same, composed, confident, quietly observant. But there was a softness to her now, something lighter that hadn't been there when they first met. Or maybe it had been there all along, just harder to see. Scott gestured lightly toward the window. It's consistent, he said. The lighting, the perspective. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. That sounds like a setup. Scott stepped closer to his desk, resting a hand against the edge. It reminds me, he said. That change doesn't have to disrupt everything. Evelyn studied him. That's a very philosophical way to talk about a window. Scott considered that. It's a versatile window. She laughed, easily, instinctively. It was still one of his favorite sounds. The office itself was new, entirely his, not inherited, not temporary, not borrowed. Scott Williams Logistics Consulting. He hadn't intended for it to happen this way. After the settlement, an outcome that still felt slightly unreal even when the numbers were in front of him, he had considered several options. Safe investments, passive income, controlled growth, efficient plans. But somewhere along the way, he had made a decision that didn't align perfectly with efficiency. He built something, smaller at first, focused, intentional, now expanding. The settlement had done more than stabilize him financially. It had forced accountability back onto the system that had failed him. The review had been thorough, exacting, and public enough that there had been no quiet resolution. Every lapse, every avoided responsibility, every overlooked detail, documented. Consequences followed. Scott hadn't pursued it for retribution. He had insisted on it for principle. The difference mattered. And the system, for once, had been required to acknowledge that it had been wrong. No child support obligation. No lingering legal ambiguity. No shadow of responsibility that didn't belong to him. Clean. Resolved. For the first time since the beginning, closed. You're drifting, Evelyn said, stepping further into the office. Scott blinked, refocusing. Momentarily. Big thoughts. Moderate ones. Evelyn crossed the room, leaning against the desk. You do realize most people celebrate settlements like yours with something a little more extravagant. Scott tilted his head. Define extravagant. Spending it irresponsibly. That seems inefficient. Exactly. Scott almost smiled. I did consider it, he admitted. Evelyn blinked in surprise. You did. For approximately 6 minutes. She laughed. That's progress. I thought so. There was a pause, comfortable, familiar. Evelyn glanced around the office. You built something good, she said. Scott followed her gaze. It functions well. That's not what I meant. Scott looked back at her. I know. Another pause. Then Evelyn said, more softly, you're not the same person you were when I found you. Scott considered that carefully. No, he said. I'm not. Do you miss him? The question lingered. Scott didn't answer immediately. He thought about the man he had been, structured, certain, confident in the predictability of systems that had ultimately failed him. Then he thought about the man who had sat in that cell, surviving on principle and consistency alone. And finally, the man standing here now. He exhaled slowly. No, he said. Evelyn nodded. That, good. Scott paused, then added, but I understand him better now. Evelyn's expression softened. That sounds right. They left the office just before sunset. Another habit. Not planned, not scheduled, but repeated often enough to become its own pattern. Scott locked the door, checking it once, not out of compulsion but out of awareness. Evelyn stood beside him, watching with quiet patience. You still check things twice, she said. Scott glanced at her. Once wasn't sufficient. Fair. They started down the sidewalk together. No urgency. No defined destination. Just movement. The city felt different now, not overwhelming, not disorienting. Just active. Alive. Scott adjusted his pace slightly to match hers without thinking about it. Another small change. Another thing he would have analyzed once but now simply accepted. You never told me, Evelyn said after a moment. Scott looked at her. Told you what? Why you stopped saying hypothetically. Scott blinked once. Then slowly he smiled. I didn't notice that. I did. Scott considered it. That might indicate a shift. Evelyn nudged him lightly with her shoulder. That definitely indicates a shift. He nodded. Then it's likely because I stopped needing the qualifier. Evelyn looked at him, curious. Meaning? Scott met her gaze. Meaning I'm no longer evaluating everything from a distance. Evelyn's expression changed, just slightly, but enough. That took you a while. It was a complex adjustment. I'm aware. They walked a few more steps in easy silence. Then Scott said, almost casually, but not accidentally, I've been considering an expansion. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Of the business? Yes. That sounds very you. It aligns with long-term stability. Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. And, Scott hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of intention. Location matters, he said. Evelyn glanced at him. And you have one in mind. I have a preference. And, Scott stopped walking. Evelyn took another step before noticing, then turned back toward him. What? She asked. Scott held her gaze. And though his voice was still steady, still precise, there was something else in it now. That preference, he said, includes proximity. Evelyn blinked. Proximity to what? Scott didn't hesitate. To you. The words settled between them. Clear. Direct. Unqualified. Evelyn stared at him for a moment, and then, she smiled. Not surprised. Not overwhelmed. Just certain. You finally got there, she said softly. Scott tilted his head. Eventually. Evelyn stepped closer, closing the distance that had never been quite as wide as either of them pretended. That's a risk, she said. Scott nodded. Yes. And, Scott's expression softened. Subtle, but unmistakable. And it's one I intend to keep choosing. Evelyn held his gaze. Then, without hesitation, so am I. Scott exhaled slowly. Not relief, not surprise, just acknowledgement. Another step forward. Another continuation. As they resumed walking, side by side now without any space between them, Scott realized something he hadn't expected, even after everything. Resolution, as it turned out, wasn't an ending. It was simply the point where the past stopped defining the future. And from there, everything else was still open, still possible, still moving forward.